Speaker. I have to admit, Mr. Speaker, there is a real temptation for me to stand here and read every single word of this into the record right now. They want me to, Mr. Speaker. They probably shouldn't goad me to. They probably. I will, and I'll come back to that, Mr. Speaker. On a more serious note, calm down. On a more serious note, Mr. Speaker, I want to start with an apology. An apology to those people, and I think this should apply to everyone, irrespective of your views and respect of the GRR. An apology to those people whose hopes and whose aspirations for the future, who have fought so hard for a piece of legislation for so long, that they now see that hope is being taken away from them. And it is being taken away from them by a government that they didn't vote for, that we haven't voted for since 1955. And, Mr. Speaker, this goes to the heart of this very issue, because this issue, at its very core, is about democracy on these islands and what democracy looks like on these islands within this United Kingdom. In Scotland's democratically elected Parliament in Holyrood, legislation has been passed which relates directly to a devolved competency. That legislation, the GRR Bill, is the most consulted upon legislation in the history of the Scottish Parliament. That legislation received support, not just from the Scottish National Party, but from the Labour Party in Scotland, Conservative Party members in Scotland, including the Right Honourable Member for Murray's predecessor, as I understand it to be the case. In a moment. It received support from the Liberal Democrats in Scotland, and it received support from the Greens in Scotland. In totality, it received support from nearly two-thirds of Scotland's democratically elected Parliament in Holyrood. It is an outrage, Mr. Speaker, that we have a situation in this United Kingdom where this government is seeking to overturn the mandate and the legislation put down by the people in our Parliament in Scotland. I will.
Thank the honourable friend for giving way, and just to give him a wee chance to look at even the first page of the reasons for this appalling decision. My honourable friend spoke earlier about the World Health Organisation and the other European and Commonwealth nations who have this legislation already, and how Scotland would be brought into line with that. And this statement says removing a number of measures which the UK Government regards as important safeguards are the very measures. Perhaps if the honourable gentleman wants to pipe down and listen, he might learn something. And these measures, which include the medicalisation of the process and indeed the breach of human rights, which include having to a trans person having to present themselves to a panel just to justify their existence, are the very things that we sought to remove because it made the rights of trans people so affected.
I thank my honourable friend for that worthwhile contribution. I didn't hear all of it in its entirety because of some of the rabid gammon to my right-hand side, but it was nonetheless an incredibly important point to make. And it's actually important, I will in a moment, it's actually important to reflect upon that, because we heard during the question session when the Secretary of State was talking, Mr. Speaker, and some of the questions that were coming from Conservative backbenchers, in and around rerunning the debate that's actually happened already in Holyrood. We've had numerous members on the Conservative benches suggesting that they oppose the GRR for a number of different reasons. But those reasons have already been exhausted in Scotland's democratically elected Parliament. If members on those benches have issues with what the Scottish Parliament has put forward, they should perhaps jump on a train, go to Scotland, get themselves elected in Scotland, to the Scottish Parliament and tried to change legislation there, rather than using this place to overturn Scotland's democratically elected Parliament. I'll give way to my honourable member for command.
I thank him for giving way. He rightly said that the GRR bill passed with cross-party support at Holyrood, including some Conservative MSPs. Now, one of the Conservative MSPs was Jamie Green, the Conservative Party spokesperson for Justice. Now, given his role, he showed good courage to vote for that. But isn't it the case that his leader, the only member for Moray, has just sold Jamie Green down the river?
I entirely agree, and perhaps the honourable member for Murray would like to address that point himself.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. When he's speaking about people who have supported and opposed the bill, can he confirm that a Scottish Government Justice Minister resigned her position to oppose the bill, a former Scottish Government SNP Cabinet Secretary voted against it, and in total 9 SNP MSPs felt this legislation was deeply flawed, was wrong, and they voted against it?
Mr. Speaker, the member, whilst he sits in this chamber, of course, already sits in Holyrood as well, and he will be familiar with the fact that the majority, the overwhelming majority of parliamentarians elected to Holyrood voted in favour of this legislation. Now, I appreciate that he lost that debate in Holyrood, but he should not be supportive of this government trying to overturn that decision. And I would be really interested to hear about the conversations that he's had with his elected colleagues in Holyrood about this particular decision.
Of course, and I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way a second time. Of course, I have had conversations because I was the only party leader in Scotland to make this a free vote, to allow members of my party to come to a conclusion, as Jamie Green did. Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP refused to do that, which is why she lost government ministers as a result.
So, if we're going to talk about losing, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman lost the debate in Scotland, and I will repeat once again, it is not democratic to try and overturn that legislation here in this place. I'm not going to give way. No, I want to make a little bit of progress. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's been inferred by some members on the Conservative benches opposite that this is in some way in conflict with the Equalities Act. Indeed, I'm sure that within this tome before me that is the case. But yet there's senior members on those benches who've also been vocal about the fact that it doesn't intervene or overturn the Equalities Act in any way, shape or form. So, which one is it? Of course I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I ask him, does he find it, does he agree with me and find it ridiculous that the Conservative Party keep claiming that they want to protect women and children's rights, given the fact that just last night this government undermined workers' rights, they want to get rid of the Human Rights Act, they introduced the rape clause, and they want to remove us from the European Court of Human Rights? Is it not the case that if you want to defend rights, you get them as far away from this law as possible?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend has made an incredibly important point in respect of that legislation last night. Because it's not just in relation to the GRR where the UK government is seeking to overturn and ignore Scotland's democratically elected politicians. That's also true of last night's legislation in relation to the right to strike. Because, and I'm not making any grand assumptions here, I would assume with wholehearted confidence that an overwhelming majority of parliamentarians in Holyrood would be opposed to the legislation that is being put forward by the UK government in terms of the right to strike. But, Mr. Speaker, that is going to be ignored too. Just as on Wednesday, tomorrow, we're going to have legislation before this House in relation to the 4,000 pieces of EU legislation which this UK government wants to throw into the wind. Legislation which puts our food standards at risk. Legislation that puts workers' rights at risk. Legislation that puts overwhelming power in the hands of Tory ministers unelected in Scotland, of course, to do as they please. Now, the Scottish Parliament has been clear once again that it opposes that, Mr. Speaker. But yet that too is going to be ignored. Scotland's democracy ignored and ignored. Indeed I will.
grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and of course he's making the powerful point about the fact that this is in its core just an attack on the rights of the people and the Scottish Parliament. But these comments that he's just made about the attacks on the Parliament have also been repeated and echoed by the Welsh Labour First Minister Mark Drakeford, who's called this intervention today, this Section 35 interference, he's called that a dangerous move. Isn't it the case that there's a deafness, not only in this place, but on those benches next to us from the Labour Party, about how dangerous these moves are for democracy across the nations of the UK?
Mr Speaker, and it appears that Mark Drakeford has more of a backbone than the vast majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party put together, and they could do well to learn from his views in respect of that. But Mr Speaker, I was making the point that democracy matters and that this UK government is seeking to consistently ignore Scotland's democracy. I mentioned the right to strike, and of course I mentioned the EU retained law bill. But it's also true in respect of Brexit as a whole. 72% of Scots want to rejoin the European Union, yet this UK government, and indeed this Labour Party, have absolutely no interest in that position whatsoever. Of course I will.
I know he's not had an opportunity to look at the statement of reasons, because it's 57 paragraphs of which you've just been served up. I've had a quick chance to have a look at this. And can I say to my honourable friend, maybe not bother having a look at this in any great detail, because it's specious, it's hypothetical and it's poorly informed. And one example of that, Mr Speaker, is on equal pay. You seem to believe that a trans man would take advantage of the opportunity to be paid less. It's the type of rubbish that's included in this. What do you think of that?
Mr Speaker, I've not obviously had the opportunity to look at that myself, but if that is the case, it is a complete and utter embarrassment. And it shows that just as this Secretary of State was unprepared today in relation to this matter, so too is his government in relation to the arguments that they are putting forward. I'm a little bit embarrassed for them in this regard. Of course I'll give them.
And he's been incredibly generous. And I just want to point out on page 1.4 one point that I think is particularly concerning, and it says in relation to those points that the government are trying to take out of the legislation that they have concerns with. Taken together, these amendments remove any requirement for third-party verification or evidence from the process. Now, if I'm not wrong, when I came out, I did not have to seek verification from anybody to be a lesbian. So I do not understand why we are treating trans people as if they are applying for some kind of arbitrary, inanimate thing. You know, this is about their identity, it's about their lives, and it's about their livelihoods, and we should treat them with the dignity and respect that they deserve.
Mr Speaker, you'll be unsurprised to know that I very much agree in that regard. But if I may return to the points I was making in respect of democracy. No, in relation to democracy, as I said, the right to strike, the EU legislation, Brexit, but also importantly, Mr Speaker, Scotland's right to choose. As we found towards the end of last year, and if the Father of the House wishes to awaken from his slumber, no, Mr Speaker, he does not appear to awaken from his slumber. Very distracting to see that in front of you in a democratically elected Parliament, Mr Speaker. If we are to reflect upon democracy, Scotland last year was denied its right to choose. Its right to choose by this UK government. Now, the Supreme Court was clear that we don't have the power under the constitutional settlement to have a second independence referendum, irrespective of the views of the people of Scotland. And yet the only answer that this UK government can give to any question in relation to that is no. No, you cannot have your say. So no matter which way we turn, no matter which issue it is of the day, this UK government is not interested in Scotland's democracy. But, Mr Speaker, let's look in closer detail at the Conservative Party position in relation to that. When it... I'll give way.
Thank Ronald for giving way. Is it not the case that these statement of reasons clearly state that the government does not have any legal basis on which to challenge this legislation, and the simple fact is that the Secretary of State for Scotland has opened himself up to judicial review of this because he will simply find that he has no modification of the existing Equality Act, and there is no examples within this outline that indicate where he has justifiable reasons for outlining this Section 35 order. None. None. Here.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Secretary of State has opened himself up to many things. Ridicule, amongst them, of course, for his failure to see the blindingly obvious. But if I may just revert back to my previous point in respect of the wider Conservative position in relation to this, let us be clear, and in no doubt whatsoever, that the Conservatives are seeking to utilise this issue for a culture war. Nothing more and nothing less. Because this is the dying embers of a failing government that sees the polls, that knows that it's on its way out, that knows that members are going to lose their seats. And in a last gasp attempt to create division, they are using some of the most vulnerable people in society to create a culture war. Absolutely, I will.
Honourable friend's very kind. He's absolutely right on that point, and we were accused earlier on in the debate in the SNP of trying to use this as a vehicle to create a constitutional schism and conflict. But in actual fact, the SNP, like all the other parties in Holyrood that voted this through in the Scottish Parliament, had a mandate from the electorate in Scotland. Is he concerned, like I am, that that government over there has no mandate from anybody for this action that they're taking?
I absolutely share the views of my honourable friend. I am deeply concerned about that, and also deeply concerned about the culture war that they are seeking to stoke, Mr. Speaker. But let's also importantly reflect upon what we have here. It's a Conservative government which, as I said, hasn't been elected in Scotland since 1955. But it's perhaps most intriguing that what we have, Mr. Speaker, is a Secretary of State for Scotland, who we know in the coming months will be walking out of this place, but he'll not be walking anywhere else but along to the undemocratic House of Lords. Mr. Speaker, Baron Jack, as he will come to be known, is trying to tell Scotland's democratically elected parliamentarians what they can and can't do, whilst at the same time knowing that he is going to end up in an unelected chamber. Shame on him and shame on his Conservative colleague. I will give way, yeah.
Why does the honourable gentleman think the Gender Recognition Act has been such a protracted dispute in the Scottish Parliament and has so divided the Scottish National Party?
I don't actually agree with him on this, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a healthy thing in democracy for discussion to be had within a parliament, and that's exactly what's happened in Holyrood. And it may have escaped his notice, but I will repeat it, because parliamentarians from each and every party in Holyrood voted in favour of this legislation. And the question to him and his colleagues is why they are seeking to overturn Scotland's democratic view in this way. And I'm more than happy to invite him back in to answer on that specific point. He's not interested in answering on that specific. I've been very generous so far, but Mr. Speaker. But of course, this isn't just about the Conservatives. This is about the Labour Party too. Should they rise from their seats and remove the splinters on this particular topic? Because this is the party who released a document last year from Gordon Brown, which was meant to put devolution front and centre, something which critics like myself said we've all heard it before. It's not going to happen. And when Scotland's Parliament is under attack from Westminster, where are the Labour Party? Nowhere to be found.
Very grateful. This is the final time I'll intervene on the honourable gentleman. I wonder if he can tell us, do all his SNP MPs here in the UK Parliament support the SNP's Gender Recognition Reform Act?
I tell you what my colleagues support, Mr. Speaker, and that is enabling the people of Scotland to make decisions over their future without interference from his Westminster government. So, Mr. Speaker, we've heard it all from the Conservatives before in terms of their culture war. We know that the Labour Party are rowing back under the Leader of the Opposition from their support for the LGBTQ+ community in relation to this specific topic. And it's deeply, deeply disappointing to hear that that is the case. And when we go to the Scottish electorate again, not only will we have a Labour Party which is against the biggest issue that dominates Scottish politics at this moment, Scottish independence. Not only are they against Scotland having its view in respect of our membership of the European Union, they're also supportive of the UK Parliament overriding Holyrood. Shame on them too, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I will, of course, do.
Grateful once again for my right honourable friend for giving way. Isn't the desperate political act of this Tory government grubbing around for one last dying ember of distraction and producing this vacuous document as an excuse, isn't it an example of desperation? But isn't it also an example, as he's been outlining, of desperation to get into power, that the Labour Party won't even take a position to support devolution, the devolution they were supposed to champion in the first place?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. And I'm absolutely confident that the people of Scotland will be watching and listening to Labour's position in relation to this. But let's not. I'm more than happy to let the honourable gentleman intervene if he so wishes. No, he doesn't. He doesn't wish to. He just wishes to chunter from a sedentary position, Mr. Speaker. But we heard. Yes, of course I did.
I'm listening to his argument, which appears to be about democracy, and in some respects I can see the power of his argument, but I'm a bit confused because it seems to me that the SNP with representatives from Scotland voted for the Scotland Act and for the Section 35 measures that are being used today, and that furthermore the fact that they can be used today in the UK Parliament is because the Scottish people voted to remain within the UK in a referendum just in 2014.
With all due respect, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member is missing the point. The democratically elected members in Scotland's Parliament have voted for legislation within a devolved competency, and the UK government, her party, are seeking to remove that or to block that legislation. That's simply not fair and it's not democratic, Mr. Speaker, in any way, shape or form. But what comes next? What comes next from these continual democratic the continual democratic deficit that we experience on these here islands? Well, I think it's actually time and it's incumbent for reasonable unionists, of which I think there are many. I don't see very many in front of me, Mr. Speaker, but which I think there are many in society, to come forward. Of course I'll get them.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. In part 2 of this big flabby document, the heading is Adverse Effects of Different GRC Regimes Across the UK. If there is no allowance of different GRC regimes, how come gender recognition is devolved in the first place?
Indeed, a very powerful and eloquent point from my honourable colleague, as always. But the point of what comes next is incredibly important. Where do we go? Where do we go when Scotland's Parliament and our views and our purpose is just being ignored by Westminster? What are we to do? What are people in Scotland how are they to respond to that? When are reasonable unionists going to stand up and say, you know what, this isn't on? If you believe in this union of equals, then you'll put the Scottish Parliament first. I don't see that. I don't hear that in Westminster. And this is the clearest example of that. And it's a very rare occurrence. I will indeed.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. And he's making a really powerful speech and really bringing the real democratic deficit really front and centre for people. But as well as the huge disappointment that I'm sure we all feel at what the UK government, the Tory government are doing, is he disappointed if I tell him that the UK Labour Party will, it is reported, not challenge this intervention at all, to the great disappointment of a number of their Scottish MSP colleagues, and that these colleagues of theirs are deeply disappointed, and no wonder that's the case.
Just as we are looking for reasonable unionists, Mr Speaker, they're clearly not found on these benches. And if the honourable member, the Shadow Secretary of State, wants to clarify that that's not the case, then he's more than happy to do so. I'll be unsurprised if he doesn't. But, Mr Speaker, the point I was making... Of course I will.
Reluctant to be goaded by the SNP, but nonetheless, here we are. Look, just to be clear, I certainly want to make sure that there is a proper gender recognition plan across the whole of the United Kingdom, because I'm sick and tired of people setting women's rights against trans people's rights. That's where I want to get to, and I'm looking for solutions to that problem, not anything else.
I do respect the sincerity with which the honourable member delivers his points in that regard, and I see other honourable members nodding. Well, if that's the case, I'm sure that the honourable member will support us, because we have a solution in Scotland. That solution is the legislation that has been put forward in the Scottish Parliament, which has received democratic support in the Scottish Parliament, and which this UK government is blocking. And he should share my anger and the anger of his, I hope, colleagues in the Scottish Parliament in relation to this particular point. But, Mr Speaker, it's a rarity in this place, and I'm sure she'll forgive me in this regard, that I agree with some of the comments for the member from Edinburgh. I can't quite Edinburgh West, Mr Speaker. But I think when we were hearing from her earlier in respect of the difficulty that this is causing her in respect of the union, that is the sort of voice that we need to hear at this moment in time from those reasonable unionists about where they seek to go. Because if this is a union of equals, as it is portrayed, if Scotland's Parliament is to be the most powerful devolved legislature in the world, as we are often told that it is, then why is this Section 35 order being used? Of course.
Grateful once again for him giving way. He's talking about reasonable unionists and said that he couldn't see any on these benches. But of course, there are reasonable unionists who have been on these benches. Would he be interested in the words of Jed Killen, former Labour MP, who said the idea that one man elected by 22,000 people can overturn the devolved legislation brought in by the Scottish Parliament and supported by the vast majority of our MSPs is outrageous and surely will not stand up in court.
Indeed, Mr Speaker, that is very much the case. And whilst we're on that point of reasonable unionists, I want to reflect upon the words of Donald Dewar in relation to the Scottish Parliament, Mr Speaker, because this is, after all, what we are talking about. He said, Walter Scott wrote that only a man with soul so dead could have no sense, no feel of his native land. For me, for any Scot, today is a proud moment, a new stage on a journey begun long ago and which has no end. This is a proud day for all of us. A Scottish Parliament, not an end, a means to a greater end. And those two are part of our mace. Woven into its symbolic thistles are 4 words: wisdom, justice, compassion and integrity. Wisdom, justice, compassion and integrity. Each of those words is reflected in the legislation brought forward in the Scottish Parliament. It's why it received overwhelming support from Scottish parliamentarians. It's why members from each and every party in the Scottish Parliament voted in favour of this legislation. And it is why it is so important that we stand up for Scotland's Parliament, that we stand up for Scotland's democracy, and that we ensure that the people of Scotland's views are heard in this place. And I sincerely hope, and I do say this, Mr Speaker, in all sincerity to the Secretary of State, I hope that he will reflect upon the damage that he seeks to do to his own union in this regard, that he vault faces,
that he shows that he does respect Scotland's democracy and that he allows this legislation to pass as it should. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Lamont. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A short time ago, the Secretary of State for Scotland made a statement to this House regarding the Government's decision to exercise the Section 35 power of the Scotland Act with regard to the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. Now, for the benefit of members who were not present at that statement, I shall summarise what action this Government is taking and why. Mr. Speaker, today the Secretary of State is making an order under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998 preventing the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill from proceeding to royal assent. As the Secretary of State has said, this is the first time the power has been exercised, and this is not a decision that has been taken lightly. However, it is a decision based on the legislation's consequences for the operation of reserved matters across Scotland, England and Wales, including on equality legislation. The Scottish Government's bill would introduce a number of changes around gender recognition in Scotland. These include reducing the minimum age a person can apply for a gender recognition certificate to 16, and removing the need for a medical diagnosis and evidence of having lived for 2 years in their acquired gender.
Is it acceptable, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister to read out the statement that has already been made, changing the order of some of the sentences?
It's up to the Minister what he wishes to say. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will continue. The bill would also amend the UK-wide Gender Recognition Act 2004, which legislated for a single gender recognition system across the entirety of the United Kingdom. Now, it's this United Kingdom Government's assessment that the bill would have serious adverse impact, among other things, on the operation of the Equality Act 2010. Effects would include impacts on the operation of single-sex clubs, associations and schools, and protections such as equal pay. There are also significant complications from having different gender recognition regimes in the UK, and there is also a danger of allowing more fraudulent or bad faith applications. I'll give way to the honourable member.
Thank the Minister for giving way. If he has regard to paragraph number 15 in what purports to be the statement of reasons, he will see that it states there, "It is practically and legally undesirable for all, including in particular the individual holder of the GRC, that a person will have one legal sex in Scotland and a different one in England, Wales and Northern Ireland." Is the Minister satisfied that this test of practicality and legal desirability or undesirability is one which is sufficient to meet the test set out in Section 35?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, well, we do have concerns. We believe the creation of the two different processes for legal gender recognition in different parts of the UK is going to create complications, which is why we have taken the action that we have. Now, if the honourable member does not agree with that assessment, with the reasons set out in our reasons paper, there is the opportunity to pray against the order, there is the opportunity to vote it down, there is the opportunity to judicial review the decision-making process. So there are other options open to the honourable member to raise those concerns. The government has taken its decision based on the legal advice that we have received. We stand by that decision. The Secretary of State stands by that decision, and honourable members opposite, if they disagree, have other options open to them to challenge that. Now, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe, and this government believes, that transgender people deserve our respect, our support and our understanding. We have a long-established, world-leading equality framework that protects everyone, including transgender people, from discrimination, harassment and victimisation, and advances equality of opportunity for all. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Section 35 power has always been part of the architecture of the devolution settlement because it is an integral part of the Scotland Act, as which we've heard already all parties in this House supported at the time. It provides a sensible measure to ensure that the devolved legislation does not have adverse effects on reserved matters, including on equalities legislation. Now, as the Secretary of State has said, it is open to the Scottish Government to bring back an amended bill for reconsideration in the Scottish Parliament, which deals with the concerns that this Government and many, many others have raised about the legislation and the impact that it will have. I'll give way to the honourable member for Badenoch Spades.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister's given it away. The Government's got concerns. Well, there we have it. The Conservatives had their objections voted down in the Scottish Parliament, so he's using the device of Section 35. Quite honestly, the statement of reasons is not worth the paper it's written on. And he knows that he can use his parliamentary majority in any praying motion to strike down an act of the Scottish Parliament. What price Scottish democracy? What price the right of the Scottish Parliament to enact legislation based on the majority in that Parliament, based on a mandate given by the people of Scotland that this Government is going to throw away because this Government, this Parliament knows better. And equality of equals, Madam Deputy Speaker, you have to be joking.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I have made clear repeatedly, the Scotland Act always intended that in these moments where there was unintended consequences of legislation being passed by the Scottish Parliament which impacted across the United Kingdom, Section 35 gives us the opportunity to act in this way. The letter from the Secretary of State to the First Minister is clear about the amendments that can be made to the bill to allow it to be approved by the Scottish Parliament and to meet the concerns in terms of the impact it's going to have to other parts of the UK. We very much want to work with the Scottish Government constructively to secure those amendments to that bill to ensure the legislation can pass which meets our concerns. So we do hope the First Minister and the Scottish Government will bring back the amended bill for reconsideration by the Scottish Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that the members opposite, the right honourable and honourable members opposite, will acknowledge that the United Kingdom Government has set out its desire to work together with the Scottish Government so we can find a constructive way forward to amend this bill so that it can pass by the Scottish Government and reach royal assent. Thank you.
Shadow Secretary of State, Scotland, Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think the time that the Minister took when responding to the SO24 shows you that the Government really don't have very much to say on this particular issue. Or maybe he didn't get the statement of reasons either in terms of what the Government were actually proposing. Can I start, Madam Deputy Speaker, by just restating again that this Labour Party is the party of devolution and the party of equality. And it won't be lost on many that the two bills that we're debating today, the Scotland Act and the Equalities Act, and indeed the Gender Recognition Act, are all Labour Party bills that we brought in the advancement of devolution and equality in this country. And it's very difficult to conclude anything other than today's debate being about two governments who are incapable of working together. I read and skimmed the 13 pages of the reasons. I mean, the farce that we've had to even try and get these reasons today as part of this debate. And when I got to the end, my initial reaction was, well, what is the government going to do about it? Because they can't just bring an unprecedented Section 35 order to this House to then lay out reasons, but then get to the end of those reasons and decide what we're going to do about it. As we stand here today, the Gender Recognition Bill in Scotland is dead unless both governments can come together and resolve the issues or perceived issues or otherwise. I'm happy to.
I just wonder whether my honourable friend has looked at paragraph 3, I think it is. Because the Minister who was not taking interventions earlier, was suggesting that all the government has to do in Scotland is bring forward a bill with amendments. So far as I can see, it would have to come forward with a bill that doesn't have anything in it. That's the only bill that the Westminster government would accept, isn't it? If you go by these, the amendments suggested in paragraph 3.
That's where we get to the crux of this process. My honourable friend from Rhondda made a similar point earlier about wanting to make sure that trans rights and women's rights are protected in this country and doing it properly. And this is certainly not the way to do it. So we now have a process whereby I suspect and we know the First Minister and the Scottish Government will take the UK Government to court on the basis of these reasons and their unseen legal advice. And then the courts will have to decide if these reasons that they've put forward are actually legitimate and indeed reasonable in terms of the bar they have to reach, that there would be adverse consequences on reserved legislation. And I think, in actual fact, at the end of that process, we might be in a situation whereby the courts are going to have to decide to resolve these arguments because both governments are unwilling to do so together. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Is he concerned, like me, that gender recognition is devolved, and yet half of the blather in here is that it conflicts with the 2004 Act? That's the whole point of devolution, is that you can actually change legislation in Scotland in a devolved policy area.
It's a very helpful intervention, because it is the case that the first Section 14, the first category of adverse effects, talks about different regimes across the United Kingdom. Well, that to me suggests that the government doesn't want this devolved. There are other issues such as abortion and other issues that would have cross-border implications that are devolved. But I would gently just say, and also in response to the Honourable Lady, that Donald Dewar designed Section 35 for the very question she has just asked. It was to allow the Scottish, but well, I mean, she does say, now, if you don't mind me repeating, but not for this issue, Donald Dewar didn't envisage all the issues that would come through. Devolution was always a journey for the Labour Party and will continue to be so. But the key point, I think, in making in this is that Section 35 was put there to enable the Scottish Parliament to be able to legislate in devolved areas that may have an impact on the rest of the UK, but Section 35 was to be used as a last resort, is what it says, for when there might be some conflict. So if the first adverse effect in the paper is that they don't want different circumstances under gender recognition certificates between Scotland and the rest of the UK, then surely they're saying it should not be devolved. I'm happy to give way.
I thank him for giving way. I agree with a lot of the points he's making on devolution. So obviously he's read what really we should be calling the clutching at straws reasons rather than a statement of reasons. He mentioned a judicial review. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure him, like me, can read this and just see how weak these UK government arguments are. So on that basis, and if he believes in the protection of devolution, that Scotland should be able to do things differently, surely he agrees with us that the UK government should drop this action now, and actually the Labour Party should be full square behind the Scottish Parliament on this.
But the point that the Honourable Gentleman forgets is this is going to end up in the courts regardless, because the Section 35 has been brought forward. Anybody who prays against the Section 35 gets a debate and a vote. The vote's not going to be won. You said yourself they have a majority of 80, a working majority of perhaps 100 on this issue, and therefore it will have to be settled in the court. And can I just say that as much as I don't want this constitutional battle to be on the backs of trans people and women's rights as well, it would be quite good if the courts did settle these issues, because maybe we could move on with substance and do what is right by trans people for equality in this country. I was going to give way to the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland.
To the Minister, the Shadow Minister, for giving way, because can I take him to paragraph number 20 in the purported statement of reasons, where it says that one of the barriers that would be encountered is existing IT infrastructure. Can the Honourable Gentleman tell me if he's ever come across a case before where apparently law has to be designed to fit IT infrastructure rather than IT infrastructure being designed to fit the law?
Well, it's a valuable intervention. I'm glad, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm getting all the questions on these adverse effects, when in actual fact it's the government's document. But you're absolutely right. And what I think we've missed in this entire debate over the last few months is the fact that people in this country currently have gender recognition certificates, just under a different process where IT systems have to deal with that particular purpose. So how you get to a gender recognition certificate is the argument here, not how you implement it, because we implement them already.
I'm very grateful. Just on the substance and on the issue of how you get a gender recognition certificate, for me one of the key things is that we take this suggestion that it's a pathology out of the process. I don't want it to feel like we are treating trans people as if they have a pathological condition. Isn't that the key thing that we need to change?
Yes, I agree, and that should be part of this argument, and we should be taking the pathology office out of this. This isn't a medical disorder. that we're dealing with here, and that should be part of the discussion. But of course, all of these, I wish we were having a debate about all these things, because actually we should be, rather than having a constitutional debate between two governments that don't want to resolve these issues but want to fight about it in different ways. Yes, I'm happy to give way if Madam Deputy Speaker allows me.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Minister, and he's seeking to cast this conflict or tension, whatever you want to call it, as being between two governments. But in actual fact, dependent on how the Labour Party decide to act, this is a conflict and a tension between two parliaments, because there is cross-party support for this bill in the Scottish Parliament from the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the SNP and the Scottish Labour Party. Whereas in this House, it's simply the Conservatives who are standing in the way of this. Can he advise how the Labour Party will move on this?
But the honourable gentleman is completely and utterly fundamentally wrong about that point. What we're dealing with today is a debate between the UK and Scottish Government. This is what's in the legislation of the Scotland Act of 1998. So what we're actually dealing with today is a debate between two well, it has to be resolved by the two governments. If you want the Labour Party to try and resolve this, then we're happy to take the seats of government either in the Scottish Parliament or here, but it's got to be resolved by the UK and Scottish governments. That's the black and white of this particular issue. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady whilst his colleague is chuntering in the background nonsense.
Tim, for giving way, and I've been interested in how he has characterised some of what we've heard today, but I need to say to him that the Labour Party, if they see that they don't have a role in this, if he doesn't think that they ought to have a view or an opinion or take a position, then he needs to make that very clear, because his colleagues in the Scottish Parliament do have a view. They did vote for these provisions, as did members of the SNP, members of the Liberal Democrats, and indeed some Scottish Conservatives. So I think he should stop being, I think, a bit disingenuous and be clear. Where does the Labour Party stand on this? Are they going to defend the rights of the Scottish Parliament to act or not?
Well, I'll tell you exactly where we stand. We want this legislation to work. At this moment in time, the legislation at this moment in time is dead. And it's dead because, well, the Honourable Lady says from central position because of them. The bottom line here is that, and the Honourable Member for Aberdeen South quoted Donald Dewar at great length, and Donald Dewar will be turning in his grave at the moment in terms of what's going on in terms of devolution in Scottish politics. But Donald Dewar created the Section 35 process for the very reasons the Honourable Lady has just said. It's a process to enable cross-border problems to be resolved. Now, let me finish the previous point first. Now, the government have come forward with 13 pages that they think adversely affects UK-wide legislation. I think it's thin. I haven't had a chance to look at it straight the way through. Well, it might be rubbish, but there are concerns that people have had that we either have to alleviate or bring people with them. What the SNP have forgotten about this entire process, and we are very experienced at this because we do it all the time, when you're doing major equalities legislation, you've got to bring people with you. And if it means that we've got to get people round the table, no, you shouldn't bring people with you. So if people raise concerns, you should just say you should just dismiss them. No, this is me saying it. Equalities legislation is difficult, and you've got to bring people with you. Now, these adverse effects might be rubbish. I think, as I've already said, at initial glance, I think they are pretty weak and pretty flimsy. But the courts are going to have to decide whether we like this or not, because that's where it's going to go. Well, and the Scottish Parliament have the right to pass this legislation because it's devolved. But also the Scotland Act protecting the Scottish Parliament has a mechanism in there written by Donald Dewar to ensure if there are cross-border concerns, those are dealt with. And that's the way it is in terms of this particular process. Madam Deputy Speaker, I haven't gone even through the first bit. Well, I'm going to give way to the honourable gentleman if he will apologise for saying we were weasels before, and I hope he's gone back and read my speech, which is not what I said during my contribution during the statement.
With the greatest respect, what I'm hearing from him now is that he neither supports the position of the Scottish Parliament, nor does he support the position of the government, and he says we need to win public support. How much public support has the Labour Party got in Scotland? And isn't this the problem he's got to face? Leaving himself with nowhere to stand in Scottish politics and falling between stools is hardly standing up for the devolution settlement of which he should be so proud that Donald Dewar established.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's quite obvious that the honourable gentleman didn't listen to my contribution during the statement and hasn't listened to my contribution since. So I had no idea which debate he's listening to, but it's certainly not the one that I'm participating in at this particular moment in time. Madam Deputy Speaker, the bottom line here is, and this is the undeniable fact whether we like it or not, the only way to resolve this today will be for either both governments to come together to try and find an accommodation, and I'm surprised they haven't done so. This has been on the card since 2016, and all we're getting now is a statement of adverse effects 1 day, 24 hours before the expiry period of when the bill is supposed to get royal assent. So coming in at the 11th hour with a Section 35, with 13 pages of adverse effects that haven't been communicated or worked with the Scottish Government before. Now, I've no doubt the Scottish Government, I'm not involved in detailed discussions at ministerial level, perhaps the Labour Party will be at some point in the future, but maybe it takes two to tangle in these discussions. But if you genuinely want this legislation through, and the Government genuinely want to try and see if there is any adverse effects that could affect residents in England, Wales and Northern Ireland that aren't part of the Scottish Gender Recognition Act, then isn't it incumbent on both governments to get together and do everything they possibly can to try and resolve this so we can get it on the statute book? Section 35 can be removed and it can go for royal assent as was supposed to have happened some time ago. And that's the grim reality in Scottish politics at the moment. It's happened with the Children's Rights Bill, where the UK Government challenged the Children's Rights Bill through the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that certain aspects of the Children's Rights Bill had overreached under Section 33 of the Scotland Act, and another one of Donald Dewar's sections that he wrote in to protect devolution. And the Scottish Government was asked to remove those sections and the bill would get royal assent, and 2.5 years later nothing has been done. And that just shows you that we are just in this political paralysis in Scotland at the moment where nobody can do anything because it's turned into political football about the Constitution, and the trans community and others are sitting there in disbelief today that that is not going to be able to be taken. Let me just make some progress. I wanted, Madam Deputy Speaker, because of accusations that had been made, just to go through a little bit of what the Scottish Labour Party's response to the bill was in the Scottish Parliament. We had a multitude of concerns with the initial bill, and nobody could have said that the initial bill that was presented and drafted to the Scottish Parliament was in any way fit to become final legislation. But we worked constructively with the legislation, constructively with the UN Rapporteur for Women and Girls, constructively with the LGBTQ+ community, and constructively with women's groups who had concerns that they were raising about the bill. And we did put forward amendments. We got the Equality Act on the face of the bill, which is referred to in a lot of the adverse effects in the government's document, and we did get many other amendments to that bill to help alleviate some of the concerns with the initial part of the bill. But the only way we're going to settle these arguments now is, unfortunately, through the courts. I'm happy to give way to the leader of the Scottish Conservatives.
Grateful to the Shadow Scottish Secretary for giving way. His UK leader said at the weekend that he has serious concerns about reducing the age from 18 to 16. However, when my Scottish Conservative colleague Rachel Hamilton brought forward an amendment to keep the age at 18 rather than reducing it to 16, Labour MSPs joined with the SNP to vote that amendment down. What's his position on the age limit in Scotland?
Yeah, but we put in protections on the age limit in Scotland. And can I just say to the honourable gentleman, we've got one party in here, the leader of the SNP, accusing the Scottish Labour Party and the UK Labour Party of different positions on this. There's nothing between the different positions, but devolution. But we should have devolution at the same time. Now, Keir's made it perfectly clear, but Anas Sarwar and his team got significant protections in terms of 16 and 17-year-olds, including the notary public issue, which means you have to swear in front of a notary public in order for this to take effect, and you have to get a responsible adult over the age of 18 in order to be able to do any of this under the age of 18. So what the honourable gentleman is essentially challenging people on is not to have different views on it, and two of his own front bench MSPs voted for the legislation. So people are entitled to have a slightly different view on what is an incredibly important subject. And, you know, The only thing that the honourable gentleman managed to do in the last week, not get both governments together to try and resolve this, was to write to me to ask my position on this bill. Well, I would rather they came together. Well, we want this bill passed, and we want the Section 35 resolved. It's as simple and straightforward as that. And you know, we've had a position for some time to modernise the GRA. We've already had the position eloquently expressed by the member for Rhondda, and that position is still the position that we currently have. And can I just say to the member, to the government, in terms of the member for Leeds Central, I think he made the crucial point, and it goes back to the member that we had the intervention from as well. The Equality Act already exists with gender recognition certificates, and those spaces, particularly single-sex spaces, are protected under exemptions under the Equality Act as we currently sit here today. And the adverse reasons that the government are giving us in terms of that is not about the process of getting a GRC, but the process that is currently already in place. The government are all over the place on this, and it's little wonder that they're fanning the flames of people who wish to break up the United Kingdom as the only result to be able to do this. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've already said a number of times, I have to give way.
Isn't it right that in the passing of the Equalities Act, it was noted then that the GRA needed reform and it needed to be depathologized? The party that came in straight after the passing of the Equalities Act, the party currently in government, has spent over 13 years, or 12 and a bit years, fiddling their fingers, fanning the flames of fear and hatred on this. And then when one of the parliaments of this kingdom has taken decisive action, rather than stepping up and working to resolve it, instead they've constructed a constitutional crisis which will benefit their voting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think that's, from the honourable gentleman, that's what I've been saying. We desperately want the legislation passed, but we desperately want to make sure that the issues raised under the Section 35 are resolved, and there's only two ways to do that, either through the courts, which I think where this is heading, or for both governments to get together. We don't have the power to be able to do either that. Madam Speaker, let me finish with this, that opinion polling shows that the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland just want their two governments to work closely together in the interests of the country, and in this particular issue, in the interests of equality. So could I say to both governments, these issues are not irresolvable. We can create an environment where protections exist for women at the same time as strengthening the rights for trans people. We can create a legal framework where GRCs issued in Scotland are entirely compatible with UK-wide equalities legislation, and we can have a country where both the Scottish and UK governments act like grown-ups, get round the table and resolve these issues. That's what used to happen. That's the way in which Donald Dewar designed this legislation that this government are now implementing. And I think genuinely constructive discussions between both governments, let's lock them in a room until they find a resolution to this, and don't let them out till they find it. And I can assure you there's a way through this, but they're unwilling to take it.
Before I call the next speaker, just to say that this debate has to finish by 27 minutes past 5, so I'm introducing a time limit. I will start with 5 minutes, but it will go down after that if necessary. Douglas Ross.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I speak in this debate as someone who's extremely privileged to both serve in this Parliament and in the Scottish Parliament. So I'm able to bring some points of view which were not accurately articulated by the leader of the SNP, who is sadly leaving the chamber at the moment, because I think it is important, because I am referring to a number of the points he made. He speaks about the legal advice. We had the situation in the Scottish Parliament when the night before crucial amendments were being debated, Conservative MSPs, Labour MSPs and indeed SNP MSPs were written to by the Cabinet Secretary about their amendments and legal advice surrounding them, but were told that legal advice couldn't be shared. Yet here we have the UK Government sharing their statement of reasons with Parliament, and I think that's, well, it is based on legal advice, and I'm just showing the different approach by the government. It is based on legal advice. That was clear from the Scottish Secretary. And also, I think it is important to recall that although the SNP leader in this place and others have said this is a debate that has been raging in Scotland for over 6 years, that's absolutely correct. I've not yet heard, and I'm willing to take an intervention from any SNP member, that can explain to me why it had to be passed by December of last year. What was the rush in the lead up to Christmas that meant it had to go through the Scottish Parliament before the end of the year? I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm delighted to just remind the honourable gentleman, and we've heard this a few times already today, that this is the opposite of rushed legislation. This has been in the works for 6 years. This has been a repeated manifesto commitment of a number of parties, and it has been the most consulted upon piece of legislation.
Hear, hear.
You might more reasonably ask, why did it take as long as it did?
The point the Honourable Lady is missing is, yes, there has been that debate for 6 years. Why then did it have to go through stage 3 and looking at amendments until midnight one night and 1:30 in the morning for it to be rushed through before the end of the session? Surely, if there was that, I will give way in a moment, but surely, if there is that much debate, that much controversy, and remember, 150 amendments, if that legislation wasn't rushed, there wouldn't have been the need to look at 150 amendments. And I do yet wait to hear any SNP member saying why it had to be put through in December of last year. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Does he not recall that the debate in the Scottish Parliament went on till those hours and votes occurred at those hours because of his stalling?
It wasn't stalling, and indeed, well, I'm sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker. Some people may say the 12 or 15 points of order we had earlier from SNP members was stalling. I don't believe that. I believe that was politicians making a point in Parliament. Just like in the Scottish Parliament, we were looking at 150 amendments because the SNP had rushed this through. And there's also been a lot made, and I'll give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member. He raises the issue of 150 amendments. That's the point, because there was effective scrutiny that took place, and he, his colleagues and other parties put down these amendments, and they were looked at in the correct manner. And of course the Scottish Parliament had to take time to do that. Madam Deputy Speaker, we should be proud of that.
And I am. And that's why I wanted that debate. That's why I just make the point. Why couldn't we have continued that debate into the new year? What was the big issue that meant the SNP and the Greens were forcing this through by the end of the year? The last couple of points I want to make in the process in the Scottish Parliament is there's been a lot said, and the leader of the SNP refused to even acknowledge. But while there are members of all parties that supported this bill, there were a significant number of SNP opponents to the bill. SNP ministers resigned in Scotland as a result of this legislation. I'll give way in a moment. But what I would say is I gave my MSPs a free vote. I think that was right that they were given the opportunity. In fairness, one of our former colleagues in this place, Michelle Thompson, who's now an SNP MSP, spoke about the dark arts of the whips within her parties who were trying to stop debate. No, this was from Michelle Thompson. She used to be an SNP MP. She was speaking about the dark arts of her whips in this debate. And I'm just interested to know about the SNP MPs who oppose this legislation. I'm not sure if any of them are here today, but I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman will tell me that there are SNP MPs that oppose his government's Gender Recognition Reform Act.
Thank you for giving way. I don't beg to speak for the rest of my colleagues, and it is a matter for record that some SNP MSPs voted against the GRR. That did happen. But the point of democracy is it was the will of the Scottish Parliament as a whole, and it's the will of the Scottish Parliament that him and his government are trying to thwart.
No, we're not, and I'll come on to explain that in a moment. The last point I want to make is, again, the Honourable Gentleman who leads the SNP here spoke about this government taking a view on the Equality Act. I can only assume then, Madam Deputy Speaker, he is unaware of the letter to the SNP Minister who led this bill, Shona Robeson, from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, dated the 22nd of September last year, long before this bill came back to the Scottish Parliament, that said there was potential cross-border implications. Indeed, the Equality and Human Rights Commission said, in our view, there is an implication for the operation of the Equality Act 2020. This isn't the Conservatives or this UK government saying it. It is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they made that very clear to the Scottish Government and indeed to the SNP. I'm really sorry, I've now got 2 minutes left, so I apologise to the Honourable Lady. There is a lot I would like to get through here. I would have liked to have heard from the Liberal Democrat MP, because it does seem in both Holyrood and here, Liberal Democrat and Labour are supporting Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP on this. And I do worry that they are treating this issue in the same way they treated children and young people with the passing of the UN Convention on the Rights of Children Bill. We were told then it was absolutely essential legislation. They then legislated under the competencies of the UK Government, and the UK Government took the Scottish Government to court. That was controversial at the time. Nicola Sturgeon said it was an absolute outrage. Yet, having heard the ruling from the Supreme Court on the 6th of October 2021, with the Supreme Court saying that legislation was flawed, it went back to the Scottish Government and it went back to the Scottish Parliament. What has happened since the 6th of October 2021? Well, I can tell you. On the 1st of February 2022, the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, John Swinney, wrote to the Scottish Secretary and said they are looking to reintroduce this amended legislation to the Scottish Parliament. Given how important the UNCRC was to SNP members and the SNP government, can any SNP MP here today tell me when that bill will be introduced into the Scottish Parliament? I'll give way to the Honourable Lady if she can tell me.
I'm not sure whether he was aware, but over the last 2.5 years there was this thing called the COVID pandemic, which actually kept several governments fairly busy.
Not sure if the Honourable Lady perhaps hadn't heard me. I was saying there was a letter from the Deputy First Minister on the 6th of February 2022. So almost a year ago, we'd passed Omicron by then, and John Swinney was telling us that he would introduce that. This is another example, Deputy First Minister, of the SNP using legislation and vulnerable people to promote a battle between the UK and the Scottish Government. We can do far, far better than that.
Order. After the next speaker, I will drop the time limit to 4 minutes. Absolutely no problem with colleagues taking interventions, but do remember it leaves less time for others to speak. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my Highland colleague from Murray this afternoon. You know, we've heard a lot today about the passage of the Scotland Act, and it probably is worth reflecting that the Scottish Parliament has only been in existence since 1999, a very different Parliament from the one that we have here, one that's elected under very different systems, the list system that means it's very difficult for a party to achieve an overall majority. There have been 7 elections to our Parliament. The SNP have been in government in the last 4, and only one of those we've had a majority. And I think to answer some of the comments made by my friend from Edinburgh South is that the SNP government has always had to try and reach a compromise with other parties, has always tried to reach a consensus. And I think over the course of that 23-year period, it's worth reflecting on how much has been done by the Parliament across party on the subject of equalities. We can be proud of the journey that Scotland has been on, and my goodness, Madam Deputy Speaker, we can be proud of the bill that was passed just before Christmas that gives equality to trans people. Really something that should gladden the hearts of all of us. And when you recall what happened in that vote just before Christmas, MSPs from all parties voting for that legislation, a substantial majority of the Scottish Parliament. Of course, parties that were elected in the main with a manifesto commitment of delivering that legislation. And as has been referred to, a debate that took place over a 6-year period, and to hear people talking about that legislation being rushed, my goodness. But there's a very important principle here, because you look at the SNP benches, and we've been here in substantial numbers since 2015, and if I think back on everything that's gone on since that period and everything that's happened since the 2014 referendum, we've repeatedly been told that this is a family of nations, that Scotland was to lead the United Kingdom, that Scotland's Parliament was to be respected. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, how many times have we been here and seen that legislation has been passed without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, throwing away the Sewell Convention that's supposed to protect the rights of the Scottish Parliament in default areas to give consent? We've seen it in so many times. We've seen it in the European Withdrawal Act. We've seen it in the Single Market Act. We're We're seeing it in the legislation which is coming tomorrow on EU laws. But the biggest disgrace, we saw it yesterday, of course, over the issue of strikes. But let me make some progress, and I will. But we also need to think about what is happening here. Because this is a bill that's been passed by the Scottish Parliament, where the Scottish Parliament has legislative powers, where the Scottish Parliament has legitimacy. And the Secretary of State is using powers given to him under the Scotland Act to strike down an act of the Scottish Parliament, and why this scrap of paper is simply not worth what is written on it. This is not about interfering with the powers of the UK government and interfering with acts passed by the UK government. This is simply about interfering with the Scottish Parliament. And it makes that point to everybody back in Scotland, that our Parliament has been under attack ever since we've been here as an SNP group since 2015 in the numbers that we have. And this is just the latest example. The UK government could have gone to court if it wanted to in this. But it's using this legislation, the powers that the Secretary of State has, a man that's going to disappear from this chamber and end up in the unelected House of Lords, that can stop an act of the Scottish Parliament, that can strike down an act that's been passed by a majority of MSPs, to strike down a bill that has the support of members of every political party. What a disgrace. And the message to the people of Scotland: if you want to stop the Secretary of State for Scotland interfering in our Parliament, if you want to stop the UK Parliament denying our rights, denying our democracy, then, friends, come with us. Complete the journey. Scotland must become an independent nation.
Sir Peter Bottomley, Father.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to listen to the former parliamentary leader of the SNP. He at least did spend a bit more time on Section 33, more than his successor did. It's certainly true that there were three ways the UK government could approach this Scottish bill. One is to say it is deeply unpopular with many people in Scotland, do nothing about it and let the SNP take the political flak, which would probably reduce the number of members of the Scottish Parliament and SNP members in the UK Parliament at future elections. That would, to some people, be the political way forward. The better way forward is, if there's something substantial in the problems that this bill may create for the UK Equalities Act, is to take action either under Section 33 or under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998. I think the government had a choice. They've chosen to go for Section 35, and that's the right choice. And when the right honourable gentleman who's just spoken refers to what's happened since 2015, I remind him, I've reminded before, that in 2017 the SNP got 37% of the vote in Scotland, and the Conservatives got 44% of the vote in the country as a whole. I think we'll see how this works out. I think the best way forward, if I can give advice to everybody, is that we follow the suggestion from the Secretary of State to the First Minister that the governments get together and work out how to have a gender recognition bill in Scotland which is compatible, and obviously compatible, with the Equalities Act, so that women don't feel that they're losing any kind of their security in any way whatsoever. I commend that to the House.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. You know, this is really a dark day for democracy. I think it's shameful that the UK Parliament and the so-called Secretary of State for Scotland, who I note is no longer in his place, would seek to override the democratically elected representatives who people in Scotland have sent to our national Parliament. It really does show complete contempt for the Scottish Parliament and for its ability to pass legislation within its areas of competence. So it's no exaggeration to call this out for what it is. It's a politically motivated assault on our democratic processes and our democratic institutions by a right-wing Tory party that has no compunction at all in using one of the most marginalised groups in our society to achieve its aims. And we need to remember what this is all about. It is about simplifying the process for people applying for a gender recognition certificate. That is all this is about. It doesn't change the effect of a gender recognition certificate. That remains the same as under the Gender Recognition Act 2004. It only seeks to improve and simplify the process by which a trans person can apply for legal recognition of their acquired gender. That's a right that's been in place for 18 years. And this bill passing represents an important step towards creating a more equal and fair Scotland, where LGBT people are valued and included and empowered. And I'm proud that the Scottish Parliament voted for that. And let's be clear, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill was passed overwhelmingly by the Scottish Parliament and by members from all parties, including the Tory party, and with the overwhelming support of SNP, Labour, Green and Liberal Democrat MSPs. And all of these parties, represented in Holyrood, apart from the Tories, had actually committed in their manifestos to improving gender recognition laws. The provisions, we've spoken about this, they're the most widely consulted upon in the history of the Parliament. And as well as the very broad and wide-ranging consultation, the Scottish Parliament's Equality, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee heard from people, including the Leader of the Irish Senate, about experiences with similar legislation there. And it's not only Ireland, we've heard about this today. These kind of measures are in place increasingly in countries across the world. This is not groundbreaking stuff. It's inconceivable to me that there is a good reason for us to be arguing about it. And we've heard about all these conversations that took place, we've heard about the amendments, we've heard about the way that it passed through Parliament with all of these conversations happening. So on any examination, this has been a very detailed and a very thorough process leading up to a very clear decision. And all of that within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. So why the UK Government, who's no friend of human rights in any guise, wants to step in, why they want to step in on this issue, which affects a marginalised group so much, is a mystery to me. It might be that the Secretary of State for Scotland has a different view to me on gender recognition reform, and that's his right, just as my views are my right. But what should not be his right, as one man, the soon-to-be Baron Jack, stepping forward and overriding the democratic voice of the Scottish Parliament, throwing his weight around just because he can. And I've read the statement of reasons now, and I still can't fathom what the basis is for this measure. But I think that whether it's on the Constitution or whether it's on the gender issue, I think that the quote of the Secretary of State and the quotes of the government actually are on a real sugary peg here. Whether we think about the Tory Reform Group and what they said, the chair of the Equalities Committee pointing out that this does not cut across equalities legislation, whether we look at what Andy McKeever has said. On all of these fronts, these people are making important points which should be listened to. But fundamental to all of that is the democratic point. The Scottish Parliament has voted for these measures and it's their right to do so.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to contribute to this debate as a passionate unionist, like many members on this side of the House. And I am concerned about any legislation that could undermine the settlement that we have within the Union of the United Kingdom. And I say this as a former Secretary of State that took a devolution bill through Parliament and was also in the Cabinet when the last Scotland Act went through Parliament as well. And having served in a devolved administration, what I understand the genuine objectives and the support that the devolved administrations hold. So the starting point, so the principle of one legislature intervening on another legislature is could be a very dangerous precedent. So my starting point in this debate would be to have sympathy with the Scottish nationalists, with what they are claiming, with what they're doing, and to understand the points in which some of them are making. That it could be a dangerous precedent. But Section 35, this is not about gender recognition. It is not about all of the sensitivities that are associated with that. This is about the process of good lawmaking, of providing clarity and providing satisfaction within the Equalities Act. And that is something that we all should be concerned about because of the people that would make use of the Equalities Act because of their vulnerability and the appalling way some of these people will have been some of these individuals would have been dealt with previously. So the synthetic anger that comes from the benches opposite troubles me, because the reality is that they often refer to the courts in order to clarify the devolved settlement, and that is fine and in order and provides ultimate clarity. And this Section 35 order, we all know, will still end up in the courts. And so why so much synthetic anger around that? Because that will provide clarity to this as well. And if they have so much confidence in waving this document around saying that it is worthless, well, that will be the finding in the court. So let's at least concentrate on the good process of lawmaking, where one legislature has respect for the other. And if there is a genuine concern, they should respond to the invitation made by the Secretary of State, where both leaders of legislatures can get together to debate and discuss and seek to deliver a positive outcome, because this is about the outcomes, not about the anger and the synthetic noises that have been made by the members opposite. So, and I then want to turn to the Labour Party, and I'm sorry that the Shadow Secretary of State is not in his place, because I am really disappointed by the approach that the Labour Party have been taking on this. They've been criticised and called different names, and legitimately so. And I say that with no gratification or pleasure or anything like that, because I thought the Labour Party was a unionist party and would want the law to be respected and Section 35 to be used for the very reason that they lay down. But the Shadow Secretary of State sought to manufacture all sorts of nonsense around this debate, rather than recognising the legitimate concerns that exist. Surely the Labour Party would want to see a good lawmaking process. So there is a time when process and principle matters to secure good legislation, but also, I would say to the Shadow Minister opposite, to secure the union as well.
Order. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member from Vale of Glamorgan, who says he's a unionist. I have no reason to doubt that, but I would assure him that I am as well. And I would like to assure not only the honourable member opposite, but the members of the government opposite and the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party that my objection to this, and my party's objection to this, is not to do with the fact that Section 35 exists. We think that that is a good check and balance. It's not to do with the right of the UK government to intervene when there is a genuine need for it. It is that this is not the time, it is not the case, and it is not appropriate. The Parliament of Scotland considered this very carefully. The honourable member for Murray talked about the letter which came pointing out potential differences, or potential problems, I beg your pardon, with the Act. I wonder if it occurred to him at all that in the year between that, or almost year between that letter arriving and the amendments being placed before Parliament, those were taken into account. That the legislation that was passed by the Scottish Parliament looked at every conceivable situation and took it into account. I asked the Secretary of State earlier if he could point out to me the section of the bill which undermines my rights as a woman, my daughter's rights as a woman, all the women I know, the children I know. And he didn't. But we have been directed to this document, this flimsy, weak apology of a statement of reason as the supposed justification for this Section 35, Order 35 intervention. And to say it's weak is to flatter it. Those of us on the opposition benches, and some who support the government, have looked at this bill in great detail. Our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament pored over it with a fine-tooth comb and considered 150 amendments. It says on the face of the bill that it will always guarantee the primacy of the Equalities Act. The Parliament of Scotland has made a decision, a considered decision. The elected representatives of the people of Scotland have made that decision on behalf of a very vulnerable section of our society. They have made progress towards a society where those people feel respected, honoured, treasured in a way that perhaps they had not done before. And I am grateful to my colleagues in the Scottish Parliament for having done that for my fellow Scots. And I have to say, I am disappointed in the government of the United Kingdom that they have taken this completely inappropriate opportunity to stage a constitutional crisis, a constitutional confrontation with the Scottish Parliament, because please be sure it is the Scottish Parliament. It is not the Scottish Government. And I would ask that they carefully reconsider the damage that they are about to do to the Unionist cause in Scotland if they do not respect the wishes of the Scottish Parliament.
Miriam Cates.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to support the Government's decision to use its Section 35 powers with respect to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill in Scotland. Now, like many other honourable members, I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to read this in full and in detail, so I will focus my remarks on a few key areas that I think are significantly important. Firstly, in paragraph 27, the Government rightly points out the bill does not create sufficient safeguards. And I think, indeed, the Government is very right to be concerned about fraudulent and malign applications, with the implications for child safeguarding. Now, this morning in the Education Select Committee, we had Professor Alexis Jay, who, of course, chaired the inquiry into institutional child sexual abuse. And it was harrowing to hear the stories of decades of child sexual abuse throughout institutions across this country. And there's one key feature of that abuse, which is that predators will exploit any loophole they can find to get access to children. And that is, I'm afraid, what will happen with this bill. We shouldn't be asking how easy is it for someone who's uncomfortable with their sex to obtain a GRC. We should be asking, how easy is it for a predator to get access to children? And I'm afraid this bill would make it vastly easier for a predator to get access to children, to change their sex, to change their gender, with an eye to exploiting loopholes of accessing children and women in particular. No, I've only got 4 minutes. So. The naivety that this has been written with is absolutely astounding and hugely worrying. I think also the reduction of the age limit to 16 is a significant safeguarding risk. The human brain does not end development until about the age of 25. You can't drive a car when you're 16. There are an awful lot of things that you're not allowed to do legally when you're 16 because you cannot assess the long-term implications on your welfare. Changing your legal gender with a potential route to long-term changes to your fertility, your sexual function, your health is not suitable for 16-year-olds. There's a huge safeguarding risk. Paragraphs 30 and 48 mention membership on the grounds of sex and single-sex spaces. Sex Matters did a report recently looking at the impact on single-sex spaces and the ability of men to access them through changing their gender. The one thing women say is, I never went back. I never went back to that swimming pool. I never went back to that counselling class. For many women, the dignity of being a women-only space, of knowing that there are no men that are going to be there, is so important. We will see a chilling effect on important single-sex rights if this goes through. And I think, as a woman, I fully understand the threats to dignity and safety that this poses, because it will change the social contract. In this country, we recognise that in toilets, in changing rooms, in public spaces, there are areas where only women are allowed. I had an experience recently in a restaurant where a man dressed as a woman walked into the toilets. I was on my own in the toilets. He stood behind me and stared at me into the mirror, looking at me in my eyes. Now, I have no idea if he intended me any harm, but my instinct, my evolved instinct as a woman, was to be frightened, because unlike almost any other species, women are far less powerful than men. We can't defend ourselves. That's why we have... No, it's a fact. The difference in strength between men and women is phenomenal. That's why we have separate sex categories for sport. Women are evolved to be wary of men in intimate spaces. That's why we have single-sex spaces. They must continue to exist for the safety and privacy of women. This threatens that social contract. Finally, it threatens the understanding of our law, which should be based on fact. And you cannot change your sex any more than you can change your place of birth or who your parents are. Now, I fully understand the complex arguments involved in this, and we should treat it with compassion. But if the law is not based on fact, then how can we trust the law? That is why the government is absolutely right to serve this notice.
Order. Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Goodness me, that speech was probably one of the worst transphobic dog whistle speeches that I've heard in an awful long time. The idea of linking trans people with predators, frankly, is disgusting, and you should be ashamed.
No, calm down. Yes.
No.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Way to you, or anyone else, to the honourable member.
Now, on the substance of this, ignoring that horrible speech that we have just heard.
Order, Peter Bottomley.
Did the Chair hear anything transphobic in the previous speech?
I have to say to the Father of the House that different colleagues, different members of this House are going to interpret speeches in different ways. And I suggest that what we do is move on quickly. I think the Honourable Gentleman needs to calm down, moderate his language, and move on to the substance of the debate. Otherwise, I will ask him to resume his seat. Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is difficult when we're talking about these emotional matters, but the reality of this is, this Section 35 is the new Tories' Section 28. It is their continuation of a war against a group of people, their culture war, that they want to pursue. And they think it will advantage them in the polls. That's what the Australian Conservatives thought as well. That's what the Republicans in the US thought. But I trust it will not, because the people do not like the bigotry that we hear from the other side. So, it is bigotry. I will give way. It is bigotry what we just heard.
I recognise the individual feels...
Could I just say to the Honourable Gentleman that we are very short of time. I hope that if he takes an intervention, he will stick to the 4 minutes. Alicia Cairns.
I recognise that the Honourable Gentleman feels very strongly about this, but I would ask him to caution labelling a party as solely one thing, because it is the Conservative Party colleagues who have led for a conversion therapy ban that today has been announced. When I was elected, no other MP talked about it for 7 months, and we have today delivered it. So I would caution him, please do not label all members of certain sides of the House to be transphobic or homophobic, and I would also challenge that anyone should be labelled that within this House.
I will say that there are some very honourable members on all sides of the House, including on that side, who have resisted the moves from the government when trans conversion therapy was removed, pushed for it to get back in, and their work is to be applauded. But what this report says, in reality, is there is no amendment that this government would accept that they would allow to pass. What this flimsy piece of paper indicates is that the only bill that they would accept is the current UK law, and anything that deviates from it would be blocked. Well, I'm afraid that is an undermining of the very concept of devolution. Just be honest. Just be honest and come and say that you want to remove the devolved competencies of this area from the Scottish Parliament and you want to return them back to Westminster. At least that would be an honest debate, rather than this dog whistle debate around the safety of children, which frankly is not correct. Now, of course there will be concerns. Of course this bill will not be perfect. No bill is perfect. But one of the key principles of my job, I think all of our jobs, is to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And let's see how this bill rolls out in Scotland. We could have seen the flaws that might have come from it, and then they could have amended it. The Scottish Parliament could have made the actions to amend, because all bills are living documents and practical. But instead, and I say this as a gay man who loves all male spaces sometimes, finds that actually the liberation of having those spaces is important. And I am sure that many women feel that the safety of all women's spaces is important to them. But this bill does not change that law one bit. GRC certificates exist at the moment. We have already a system where you can change your passport and your driving licence without a GRC certificate. Going into a toilet or a public facility or a refuge is not contingent on a certificate at all. So all of those arguments are bogus. And to continue a bogus argument, knowing that it is bogus, is, I'm afraid, a form of bigotry.
Craig McKinley.
And Speaker, I'm rather concerned because the honourable member from Brighton Kempton might have a seizure at the end of my speech, but we'll do our best to keep him calm, Speaker. As we start this, I have the words of the honourable member from Murray ringing in my ears that before, or as this legislation was making its way to the Scotland Parliament, that they received no legal advice that we have received here today in this good form of document. Whether you agree with it or not, it is available for our analysis. But it seems that as this legislation went through the Scottish Parliament, no such advice as to whether Section 35 there are overtones and issues, or whether the Equality Act 2010 had any overtones and issues. Now, I do have issues with the whole concept, but I'm not going to stray into that too much. But on the age of 16, I find this scarcely believable that even in Scotland, a 16-year-old can't drive, a 16-year-old can't buy alcohol, a 16-year-old can't buy cigarettes. Please.
They can vote.
In Scotland, a 16-year-old can vote and they can get married without parental consent. So, and join the armed forces. So I would urge the honourable member to take credence of the actual situation in Scotland.
I was going to cover the things that you can do at 16. I do understand that in education in Scotland, the access of the armed forces to actually encourage a future and a career in the armed forces is actively discouraged, which is taking a lot of people away from what is a credible and superb future employment. But in Scotland, I always like to give the sunbed rule. Can't even go on a sunbed in Scotland, and yet here we are. You can't contract, and yet here we are. We all wanted to do lots of things at age 16, and I will declare to the House I rather wanted a tattoo and an earring at age 16, and here we are at age 56, and I'm damn pleased I didn't go up that route. But what it does mean when I lay on the beach is that most people now sort of point at me and say, look at that, there's a guy without a tattoo on this beach. Now, the other safeguards that I'm concerned about is about sex offenders. I mean, are we really that naive to think those that are so minded will not exploit some of these rules to do things that we know that they will be minded to do? Are we really that naive that we are left to think that people will do the right thing in all circumstances? Now, I am an absolute libertarian conservative. I have no interest how people want to live. That is a matter for them. I have completely no interest, and I don't bring my opinion to this place for legislation. That is not my interest or concern. And I steadfastly do that. People can do exactly as they please. I'd be delighted to.
With him, I do question some of the elements of this bill, in particular why the amendment making clear that anyone going through being charged and trial for sexual offences should be excluded. I think that was madness. But I would just question one point of his argument. What evidence is there that by a man becoming a woman, he somehow has more privileged access to children than he currently does as a man? This is what I cannot understand within the argument.
The Honourable Lady hasn't been here for the whole of the debate. I am getting concerned that people who've been here are not going to be getting. So I am going to say that I will reduce the time limit now to 3 minutes, but I would urge the Honourable Gentleman to bring his remarks to a close, because otherwise he'll have taken a lot more time than...
I thank my right honourable friend. I could go into quite a story, actually, about a nurse, a transsexual woman that was presented to a constituent of mine and the daughter for an intimate examination, but it's a story for another day that I haven't got time to examine here today. But I'm concerned that the potential for obtaining a GRC is much easier and much reduced, rather than what I think has been a well-debated and well-rehearsed and settled argument across the UK up to this date, where living as an appropriate the opposite sex or in a different sex for 2 years, having some medical advice and intervention, and the guarantee and offer that one shall live in that way for the rest of one's days, has been the settled will. I think that's sensible. I'm fully in agreement with that. And as I say, I'm a libertarian conservative, so I really don't mind what people want to do. But this is an issue about Section 35 of the Scotland Act. This changes the Equality Act 2010. It changes the way we live, and I support the government.
Alison Doolis, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to support the right of the Scottish Parliament to legislate and to oppose this government's attempts to override the democratic wishes of our democratically elected Scottish Parliament. We join in Scotland countries like Denmark, Malta, Ireland, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, Ireland, Switzerland, Argentina, Uruguay and New Zealand in doing this. The UK Government has not acted itself, yet it seeks to deny the Scottish Parliament the right to do this. The very thin statement of reasons that the Government has brought forward really is a whole load of supposition, guesswork and nonsense within this. We can't possibly have gender equality. We can't possibly have this legislation in Scotland because HMRC can't fix its systems. We can't possibly have this in Scotland because the UK Government is second-guessing the number of people that might actually take it up. We can't possibly have this in Scotland because the very tiny, small, limited number, a handful of private schools that still offer in Scotland single-sex places might have a problem. This is ludicrous nonsense and very, very thin. But what I do want to raise in here particularly is a statement by all of the women's organisations in Scotland who have stated today too much of this debate around this bill has been shaped by misinformation on what the bill will actually mean in practice. The majority of human rights, women's and equalities organisations in Scotland have shown clear, consistent and unified support for this legislation throughout its 7 years in development. And there's a longer statement that is signed by Amnesty International, Close the Gap, Engender, Human Rights Consortium, Just Rights Scotland, National Union of Students Scotland, One Parent Families Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Trade Union Congress, the Scottish Refugee Council, Scottish Women's Aid, Scottish Women's Convention, Scottish Women's Rights Centre, Young Women's Movement and Zero Tolerance. So if the UK Government ministers in this place think they know better than these experts with years of experience in dealing with vulnerable women, they really have another thing coming. They should reject their actions today. They should draw back from opposing this bill and they should let the Scottish Government get on with the business of giving trans people the rights they so richly deserve.
Nick Fletcher.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to start where the SNP leader finished off. He's not in his place, sorry about that. Talking about wisdom. I want to ask, where is the wisdom in the removal of the requirement of an applicant to have or have had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria? Where is the wisdom in reducing the minimum age for applicants from 18 to 16? Where is the wisdom in the period for which an applicant must have lived in their acquired gender before submitting an application from 2 years to 3 months? Where is the wisdom in the removal of the requirement for an applicant to provide any evidence that they have lived in their acquired gender when submitting an application? Where is the wisdom in the removal of the requirement for a panel to be satisfied that the applicant meets the criteria? There may have been 6 years of consultation. There may have been many experts who have gone through this, but unfortunately there has been no common sense. The only common sense that I have heard today and the wisdom that I have heard today is for the Secretary of State to use Section 35 to protect women and children in England. I have spoken on this subject before, and I have been vilified for saying transgender children, they are just going through a phase, only for the NHS to write an article a few weeks later saying the majority of children are going through a phase. This is a toxic subject, and it is now being used by the SNP as a political football. But I want members to remember, across this House, what this is all about. There are families in this country now where their boys and girls are coming home from school and saying they are in the wrong body. These sorts of things are being glamorised on TV as though it's a wonderful thing. Well, let me tell you, it is tearing parents, families and children apart and setting children on a path of puberty blockers, hormone replacements and then onto surgery. It is a disgrace what we are doing with children and it must stop. I just hope that the parents of those children who come home and have to hear their children go through this show the wisdom and stick fast and hard to their beliefs that they are born, their child was born in the right body, and we should do all we can in this place to protect those parents, protect women and protect children.
Neil Hanvey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to make it clear that balancing rights is not a simple
task. Balancing rights is complicated and it requires proper attention. We've needed constructive discussion on equality and rights for years, but that has been consistently dismissed and denied. This is entirely the wrong issue for a constitutional clash. It's a matter of public record that I, myself and my party have grave concerns about the format and consequences of this bill, as it has alienated women campaigners and defenders of the rights of women to access single-sex spaces across Scotland. But there are a couple of points I want to make for the Secretary of State's attention. A Section 35 order is absolutely the wrong approach. The Secretary of State said earlier today that the SNP had not objected during the passage of the Scotland Bill to override the clause which has been invoked today. I have to tell him that is simply not the case. Far from the Section 35 override clause being agreed to by the SNP, it was objected to strongly, most of all by my party leader Alex Salmond. It was realised then it would cause the very trouble it is creating now. There are two questions for the Secretary of State, and he must address them. Firstly, if it is inappropriate to use Section 33, will he now publish that legal advice, however exceptional to do so that is? And secondly, why has the Secretary of State not used Schedule 6, Part 1 of the Scotland Act, as that would surely have been a route open to him? That Act, the part of the Act states at Schedule 6, Part 1, that in the schedule devolution issues means any other question about whether a function is exercisable within devolved competencies or in as regards Scotland, and any other question arising by virtue of this Act without reserve matters, the matter was not referred to under that schedule. Why? I have no concerns about trans people. My concern is, and always had been, about bad actors. As mentioned earlier today regarding the police case that's been in the press today, predators are determined and devious, and they will go to extraordinary lengths to access their prey. We know that through various reports, not least the behaviour of organisations in the Lambing report about overly optimistic and unrealistic views of predators. 42% of trans-identifying prisoners are on the female estate are sex offenders. That's not representative of the trans community. It's a distortion. So any suggestion that people will not use it for nefarious ends is wrong.
Order. James Daly.
Very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I rise in support of the Government, my honourable friend from Don Valley, and more specifically my honourable friend from Penistone and Stocksbridge, who is one of the most thoughtful, honourable people in this House. Yeah. And the language that has been used against my honourable friend is typical of the language of the left for people with deeply held, honest views. And it is the word disgusting was used across there. It is disgusting that my honourable friend was treated in that way here today.
Yeah. Remove the whip from him.
Now, I think this, in general, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been a good debate. We have had the normal debate every single time I'm in this chamber listening to my honourable friends from the SNP. No matter what the debate, we come back to independence, one version of it or another. And when we look at the title of this debate here, there's two things to talk about. The first is, as it says up there, Section 35 power. Now, the question therefore legally, constitutionally, is are the government entitled constitutionally to use that power to intervene on this decision of the Scottish Government? And clearly they are. There is simply no argument against that. The Equalities Act of 2010 is the legislation within the United Kingdom that guarantees equal human rights, equal rights for everyone, no matter where you live in the United Kingdom. This piece of legislation from the Scottish National Party amends the 2004 Act, the Gender Recognition Act, and that brings it in to the competence of Section 35 because, as has been said previously, the Secretary of State is entitled, if there are adverse effects of this legislation and the impacts of the operation of the Equality Act that result from the fact that the GRC changes a person's protected characteristics of sex for the purpose of the 2010 Act. So that clearly does. There is a legal basis to what the government. So if we go away from that, constitutionally, The government are entitled to do this. We can have a debate regarding what are the merits of one argument or the other, but the government are entitled to do this. They are the elected government of the United Kingdom. We talk, and I know my friends from the SNP would prefer us not to talk like this. We are the United Kingdom, and legislation like the Equalities Act 2010 applies to us all. Now, in terms of the issues that we're talking about here, because of the competences, because of the Section 35, it brings within the scope that people, members such as me, from English constituencies, can speak in respect of this. And I believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm sure I'm waiting for somebody from the Labour Party to call me transphobic or something, I believe that 16 is too young for these decisions to be made. I believe that this legislation is a direct threat to women's rights, sex and health-based rights, and especially single-sex spaces. Now, those are genuinely held beliefs, so the government are entitled to do this. The government share my beliefs, and they are entirely correct in what they are doing today.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a policy statement, not a legal document, and one so thin that it's absolutely translucent for such an unprecedented unilateral action in invoking the Section 35 powers. And frankly, I've been disgusted by a lot of the tone of the debate today. There are a lot of people who I'm very interested to hear suddenly become massive defenders of equality, including the Honourable Member from Don Valley, who I remember being in a Westminster Hall debate with when he said that Doctor Who being a woman was turning boys gay, among other ridiculous arguments.
Give way.
Please.
Will you give way?
That is not.
I won't give way, actually. I think we've had more than enough. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I will not withdraw it.
No. The honourable gentleman must resume his seat. Must resume his seat. If he wants to say a point of order, he can make a point of order.
Point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Point of order, Nick Fletcher.
Honourable member to withdraw that and refer to answer. That is not what I said. That is an outright lie.
No. The honourable gentleman must qualify that. I think he meant she may have unintentionally misled the House. Is that what he is going to say? I hope it is.
Yes, it is, Madam Deputy Speaker.
It is. And I hope, with regard to the point of order, which obviously he was addressing to me, to say that he felt, on a point of order, that what had been said was incorrect. My response to that is that if the honourable lady at any point feels that what she has said, when she goes back to look at the debate, has unintentionally misled the House, that she will correct the record. And I'm taking her word for it that she will do that. Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And on checking Hansard, the honourable member actually said that Doctor Who, being a woman, was turning boys towards a life of crime. So clearly it was a matter of misogyny rather than homophobia. However, I am very sorry for having inadvertently misled the House in accusing the member in a very legitimate comment that I made about his brand new respect for our equality legislation, in having made a remark that was misogynist rather than, in fact, homophobic. So I apologise for that omission. I will not give way. We've heard more than enough from the honourable member today. What I would like to talk about is the substance of this piece of paper, because, frankly, it is an absolute joke. I will declare an interest as an LGBT woman, as someone who is myself LGBT and exists, something that's been forgotten entirely in this debate by people that are trying to draw a false distinction between the rights of women and the rights of LGBT people, including trans people. I'm afraid that I don't have the time that I would like to go through all of the clauses in here, which, as I said, are so flimsy as to be ridiculous, including Clause 20, which I'm calling the computer says no clause, which, as the Shadow Minister referred to earlier, says that the law can't be changed because the computer system couldn't handle it. The computer system should be changed to abide by the law, not the other way around. These adverse potential impacts are flimsy. This piece of paper is an absolute nonsense, and as I said, there is just no justification whatsoever for such an unprecedented action in invoking Section 35.
Mr. Blackman. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to start with an apology to all of those trans people in Scotland who had the hope that they were going to be able to get the gender recognition certificate that they can't currently get because they cannot provide thousands of pages of evidence, because they cannot go in front of a panel, because they cannot get a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which the WHO has said should not be necessary in order for a gender recognition certificate. I want to apologise that we've given them that hope, and the UK government has again dashed that. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are a room full of cis people talking about the lives of trans people. That is what we are doing in this room. We are talking about the lives of other people. We're talking about rights that do not affect us in the privileged, entitled position that we have here. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to know why the UK government has suddenly decided that it's going to try and protect vulnerable women and children. Suddenly it's decided this. It didn't think this when it was talking about the rape clause and implementing that. It didn't think this when it was demonising migrants and refugees. It didn't want to protect women and children until today, when it seems like they can suddenly use this wedge issue to attack trans people, to demonise the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government for the decision that we have taken, the decisions that we have taken in Scotland to try to improve the lives of our trans constituents. Madam Deputy Speaker, I asked the Secretary of State earlier, I asked him what a gender recognition certificate does. He did not have the faintest clue what a gender recognition certificate does, yet he's got the power to veto this legislation from the Scottish Parliament. I've looked at the statement of reasons, and it has no reasons that have any impact on the lives of women and girls who are not trans. It does not have any impact on the lives, because it is a manufactured grievance. The Labour Party is absolutely correct. It's a manufactured grievance by the Conservatives. They are cynically using the lives of trans people to create this conflict. A gender recognition certificate does not allow you access to bathrooms. It does not allow you access to changing rooms. It does not allow you to change your passport or driving licence. You can do that without a gender recognition certificate. All it does is allow you to live and die in dignity. It allows you to have the correct gender on your death certificate. It allows you to have pension providers recognise your gender. It is something that trans people need and cannot currently access because of the massive barriers put up in the current Act. Devastated that people over there are suggesting that we should roll back on the current Act even. What we should be doing is making life better for people and improving human rights, not dismantling them. Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First and foremost, this is an attack in devolution. This is an attack in the elected members of Scottish Parliament, and it's an attack made by a Scottish Secretary who's never actually respected the institution of the Scottish Parliament in the first place. He's always thought Westminster was more important, always thought Westminster had primacy over the Scottish Parliament. Now, it's the same Scottish Secretary that tells us we've got the most powerful devolved Parliament in the world. We don't even have the most powerful devolved Parliament in the UK. The Northern Ireland Assembly's got much greater powers than Scotland, including pensions and rights over the Union, to name but two. And then, Madam Deputy Speaker, when you listen to the arguments in here today, the right-wing Tories standing up pretending to speak for women's rights. Right-wing Tories that are part of a culture war. Right-wing Tories that then have the cheek to say that we're manufacturing a constitutional debate. How can us manufacture a constitutional debate when 2/3 of the Scottish parliamentarians elected to the Scottish Parliament voted for the GRR? I can't give way, we don't have enough time. So it's absolutely grievance politics and a culture war from the Tories. And then we get the clutching at straws reason of statement. Now, somebody tried to say this is legal advice. It's not legal advice. Everybody knows if you pay a lawyer, you can get a lawyer to write what you want. And that's what this is, a list of bogus reasons to come up for reasons for the Scottish Secretary to introduce a Section 35. Now, let's look at the equal pay section. It's unbelievable. It's saying transgender people are going to cause problems with equal pay, because if somebody transgenders from becomes a transgender woman, then they might have been in higher pay before, and that's going to affect the claims. They're also saying somebody actually transitioning could affect the claim of somebody else's equal pay claim because they can't use that person as a benchmark. If you're talking manufactured grievance, you can't make that up. In actual fact, that must happen just now when people have already got a GRC certificate. So if it doesn't undermine equal pay settlements just now, how can the GRR undermine equal pay settlement? Now, the bottom line is, you know if you're on the right side of the argument when the opposite side of that lot there, comparing trans people to predators, it's an utter disgrace. And Monofemo's already did it. But you know on your right side of the argument when Amnesty International closed the gap in gender, Human Rights Consortium, Just Right Scotland, NUS Scotland, One Parent Family Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Trade Unions Congress, Scottish Refugee Council, Scottish Women's Aid, Scottish Women's Convention, Scottish Women's Rights Centre, Young Women's Movement and Zero Tolerance on the same side as us.
The question is that this House has considered the Government's decision to use Section 35 of the Scotland Act with regard to the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. Aye. Clear the lobby. The question is that this House has considered the Government's decision to use Section 35 of the Scotland Act with regard to the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tellers for the aye, Stuart Anderson and Mike Wood. Tellers for the noes, Peter Grant and Stephen Bonnar. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 318. The noes to the left, 71.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 318. The noes to the left, 71. So the ayes have it, unlock. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day. We hope.
The Online Safety Bill as amended on recommittal in Public Bill Committee to be considered.
Now.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.